It's called the Le Marchand configuration, it said, pointing at the box. She looked down. The pieces were no longer in her hand, but floating inches above her palm. Miraculously, the box was reassembling itself without visible aid, the pieces sliding back together as the whole construction turned over and over. As it did so, she caught fresh glimpses of the polished interior, and seemed to see ghosts' faces, twisted as if by grief or bad glass, howling back at her. Then all but one of the segments was sealed up, and the visitor was claiming her attention afresh. The box is a means to break the surface of the real, it said, a kind of invocation by which we Cenobites can be notified. Who? She said. You did it in ignorance, the visitor said. Am I right? Yes. It's happened before, came the reply, but there's no help for it. No way to seal the schism until we take what's ours. This is a mistake. Don't try to fight. It's quite beyond your control. You have to accompany me. She shook her head. She'd had enough of bullying nightmares to last a lifetime. I won't go with you, she said. Damn you, I won't. As she spoke, the door opened. A nurse she didn't recognize, a member of the night shift presumably, was standing there. Did you call out? She asked. Kirsty looked at the Cenobite, then back at the nurse. They stood no more than a yard apart. She doesn't see me, it told her, nor hear me. I belong to you, Kirsty, and you to me. No, she said. Are you sure? Said the nurse. I thought I heard. Kirsty shook her head. It was lunacy. All lunacy. You should be in bed, the nurse chided. You'll catch your death. The Cenobite tittered. I'll be back in 5 minutes, said the nurse. Please go back to sleep. And she was gone again. We'd better go, it said. Leave them to their patchwork, yeah? Such depressing places. You can't do this, she insisted. It moved towards her nevertheless. A row of tiny bells depending from the scraggy flesh of its neck tinkled as it approached. The stink it gave off made her want to heave. Wait, she said. No tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering. Very, very interesting. Going back to reread this. Didn't take me very long. Actually, it's such a short novella. It's nothing. I mean, it barely constitutes a novella. I'm fairly certain that Barker has written short stories that are longer than this, that are included in some of his collections. It's 128 pages, so barely a novella. Fascinating going back to read a story that you're so familiar with and yet still contains elements of surprise. As I said in the previous video, one of the more interesting things about this book is comparing and contrasting it to the movie adaptation, which I think the vast majority of people are far more familiar with. I mean, in fact, most people don't even know that Hellraiser is based on a book. Vast majority of people don't. I certainly didn't until well into my obsession with Barker's work. It took me a long time to find that there was a book of Hellraiser. And it's something you have to really appreciate in context, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a first work. It's Barker's first published novel. And as a result, it's his first published anything, insofar as I'm aware, apart from the plays, the sort of the theatre work he was putting on when he was part of a small troupe called the Dog Company, which were independent. That was when he and Doug Bradley, who would later come to be known as Pinhead, the actor who has most consistently played the Pinhead Cenobite, and a number of others, were on the dole, living in a squat in London and using what little money they could scrape together to put on these productions. and to produce little independent films and whatnot, some of which are rather easy to find. There's a couple of them on the, if you have the Hellraiser Lament configuration DVD box set, there's a couple of them on there, The Forbidden and an adaptation of Salome, Salome by Oscar Wilde, I believe. Interesting pieces of work, very abstract, very, very art house. They're the kind of things that are rather difficult to appreciate unless you're into that sort of thing, which I am. I really like them. But yeah, this is it's a very easy read, as most of Barker's work is. But if you know the man's work, if you know where the heights that it really reaches in the likes of Sacrament and Weaveworld and Imagica, you have to appreciate this in context. It's the only way to read it. You have to appreciate that this is a naive piece of work. The prose is not quite as balanced or as measured as it later is. It's not as precise. One of the more interesting things about rereading it is how lush the prose can be and how slightly awkward it can sometimes be. Sometimes it feels like the vision and the inspiration is beyond the abilities of the writer, which is undoubtedly the case. He was obviously quite young, late 20s when he wrote this, so that's most likely the case. Still, it's very, very enjoyable. It's probably one of the most easily readable of Barker's works because it's more timid. Despite how absurd and surreal and extreme the film material is considered to be, the book, although it does contain hints and elements of that extremity, is actually pretty tame. And certainly in terms of the tone, as you no doubt noticed from that extract that I read there, it's much less intense and more passive than it is in the film version. And that's something that's consistent throughout. Almost everything is. The Cenobites, most notably, those scenes of absolute extremity in the film, the sadism, the masochism, the flesh hooks, the skin stretched to breaking, the Cenobites themselves with their hideously mutilated designs, they do occur in this, but they're more suggested than anything else. They're certainly more general. Like, for example, the book does not state what Cenobites come to take Kirsty or Frank. There's no specific Cenobites as such. It gives generalizations. You have odd little details, like there it talked about the bells that had been threaded through the throat of the Cenobite. There is later a description of the pin-headed Cenobite, which is very different. In fact, I think in the book, the pin-headed Cenobite is a female Cenobite. The Engineer, which is probably one of the most complex special, and certainly one of the most expensive special effects in the film, is that huge sort of monstrous, leprous, abhuman thing that appears in the wall when Kirsty first opens the Lament configuration is not in this. The Engineer itself is, but it is not that entity. It's far more abstract. It only appears at the end, and it's not threatening. It's not threatening at all. It doesn't threaten Kirsty. In fact, none of the Cenobites do, apart from in that scene when she first calls them. After she's made the deal with them to lead them to Frank, who escaped them, they keep it. It's not like in the film where they turn on her at the end, and so you get the final chase through the house on Ludovico Street. That doesn't happen here. The house does collapse, but the Cenobites just tell her to go away. After they've got Frank and they've got him strung up by the flesh hooks, they just tell her to get lost, essentially. The Cenobites themselves are very different entities in the book. And I don't know which I like better. They're more ambiguous in the book, and I usually like that more, to be honest. I find that more interesting. I'm not interested, I'm not sure, I don't think Barker himself is either, from interviews that he's read and also just knowing his work. Barker is not interested in the monstrosity of monsters. He's not interested in the horror of horror. It's sort of a one-trick pony. It can only go so far. What Barker's interested in and what his audience tend to be interested in is the ambiguity of those states. It's the attraction of monsters. There are hints of it here. The Cenobites come not with threats but with promises more than anything. That's the language they speak. And some of that is in the film, some of it, but not as much. They are way more threatening in the film. For example, in that scene where they first come to Kirsty, in the film you have that classic threat, which was in all the trailers and which has become sort of an emblem of the films, where Pinhead says, "If you cheat us, we will tear your soul apart." In the book, that's slightly different. The line is here, but what happens is the Cenobite. There's only one Cenobite that comes to Kirsty, the one with the bells through its neck, and it's sort of laconic. It says to her, "It's thinking about it. I'm not sure. I don't know. I might prefer to take you back with me. I don't know. I'll tell you what." You take us to Frank, and then maybe we won't tear your soul apart. And it's stated in this much more ambiguous, almost passive way. I mean, that's the most significant thing you get from the Cenobites in this book. It's a kind of boredom. They're laconic, and that is in the films, but at the same time, they are way more active in the films, way more aggressive and active, and seem to enjoy what they're doing a little bit more. In this, you get the impression that they're tired of being summoned. They've seen it all before. They're just bored. It's like, oh, you can't show us anything new. We've done this a million times before. You can show us nothing. And that's kind of an interesting tension. You get that a lot in Barker's later fiction, actually. And that is something that contextually makes this book worth a read, especially if you're a Barker fan, because you see the beginnings of sort of the seeds of the consistent tropes and images and themes that come up again and again and again in Barker's work. The passive and ambiguous monster characters, the ones that come with promises rather than threats, that have a certain attraction about them, no matter how hideous they might be. The empowered women. That's another thing that occurs in Barker's fiction all the time. There are female characters who start off quite banal, who are trapped by domestic situations or by their own assumptions of personality, who then learn better of themselves through abstract and weird experiences. Julia is definitely one. Julia becomes empowered by her violence, by her murder for Frank. And Kirsty is sort of the counterpoint to her. Kirsty is this kind of unsympathetic character in this. Barker doesn't have much sympathy for normal or domestic or passive characters, and Kirsty is a really good example. She's not his name, the father character, I think his name is Larry in the film. In the book, his name is Rory. I don't know why that change was made, but Rory Cotton, who is Frank's brother and Kirsty's father in the film, is not Kirsty's father in this. She's just a vague family friend. She's a friend of Rory's and of Julia's, who has a kind of, not even a passion, she has an affection for Rory. And she's almost like a Julia's competitor in that regard, but cannot. The way she's presented, whenever it's in contrast to Julia, is in this sort of dowdy, mousy, passive way. Barker, as the writer, has way, way more sympathy for Julia. So do you as the reader. You're led to have way more sympathy for Julia. But Kirsty does discover herself as a result of her experiences with the box and with Frank and whatnot, and becomes less passive, less dowdy, more active later. And that is a theme that comes up again and again and again in Barker's work. You get it in with, I think her name is Tess in Cold Heart Canyon, who is, once again, this very domestic, very dowdy housewife character who, via her experiences, becomes something else. You get it with Jessica in Weave World, who again starts off very, very normal and actually ends up becoming a kind of divinity, almost like a sorceress character. You have it with who else? There's quite a few actually. Judith in Imagica is another very good example. there are several characters in the Books of the Art, in the Great and Secret Show, who go through that process, that sort of annealing process where they become abstracts of themselves. They start to operate in spheres that are far more complex and ambiguous and potential than the ones they start out in. That the seeds of that are here in the Hellbound Heart. It's not the best of Barker's books. Of course, it's not. It's the first, so it will not be the best. It's slightly naive, it's slightly clunky, it's a bit too short, some of it is not as fleshed out as you'd like it to be, but it's really, really interesting. It's an interesting start, and it was lots of fun going back to reread it. Now, the next books on the list are much bigger than this, arguably much more ambitious, and they're going to take me a little bit longer because there's 2 volumes which are quite thick. The Books of Blood, which are Barker's first short story collections, and these books are absolutely beloved. I want to do them justice, so it may take me a little while longer to read and review those, but stay tuned. The Books of Blood are coming up.